Welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We're delighted that you're joining us to hear evidence-led discussion about topics that are critical to the way that we manage our water and environment. A huge thanks to our season sponsor, Atkins Realis, and you'll hear a little bit more about them later. And as ever, we're grateful for their support in bringing the pod to you. If you're new to Planet Possible, I'm Niki Roach. I'm a passionate advocate for all things water and environment and a fellow of CIWEM, which is the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. So November has been a busy month in the news for conversations about our changing climate. If you're in the UK, your screens will have no doubt been filled with stark images of severe flooding following rapid snowmelt due to Storm Bert. Southern Spain has experienced record-breaking floods, and we'll be covering these in our December episode. South America's seen wildfires, and we've had violent storms in Florida. And it's against this backdrop that the annual Climate Conference of the Parties, COP29, held in Baku, Azerbaijan, has been taking place. As the UN said ahead of the conference, extreme weather events are accelerating and intensifying across the world. With the cost of inaction clearer than ever, financing for clean alternatives to the fossil fuels which are driving climate change will be top of the agenda at this year's UN Climate Conference, COP29. So, in today's episode, we're digging into what happened at this COP, whether it went as experts expected, and what it means at all scales, from international agreements to local action. And we'll be hearing from the chair of the UK's Climate Change Committee, who represented us at COP29, Piers Forster, in a moment. So to help us navigate the topic, I'm joined by a wonderful co-host and director of both the Leeds and Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commissions, Rosa Foster. So welcome to Planet Possible, Rosa.
Thank you very much, Niki. It's lovely to join you.
So, you lead both the Yorkshire and Humber and the Leeds Climate Commissions, bringing together public and private and third sector actors to support, guide and track the delivery of some ambitious climate actions across the region. So in that role, what does COP29 mean to you?
It's an interesting question, Niki, because day to day, things generally don't change too much around COP29. It's obviously an opportunity for things like this and conversations around climate action to be given into the limelight. But day to day, it doesn't change too much. This year has been a bit different with Keir Starmer's commitment on the national determined contribution, which is fancy language for saying what our part is going to be in terms of reducing our carbon emissions as a country within that international sphere. And so actually this year it means quite a lot because his commitment is about bringing the UK to 80% reduction in its emissions by 2035. And for Yorkshire and Humber, we've been working to a net zero target of 2038, which until the last couple of weeks has felt like a rapid acceleration compared to the national target of 2050. But now it means that the leadership that we've been demonstrating and how we've been pulling things together at both city level and across Yorkshire and Humber with a broad range of partners means that we're in a really, really strong place to support government with that ambition.
Brilliant. That's a great introduction, Rosa. Thank you. So for our big interview, we're joined by Professor Piers Forster. And Piers is the interim chair of the UK's Committee on Climate Change. And he's also director of the Priestley International Centre for Climate and a professor of physical climate change at the University of Leeds. And Piers has played some really significant roles authoring multiple intergovernmental panel on climate change reports. So let's hear about COP29 from Piers. You have just come back from COP29 in Baku. What were the key outcomes that you were hoping to hear from the COP before you went?
In terms of what I was expecting, I guess I'm quite experienced at going to these COP conferences, and so I think I wasn't expecting a huge deal, and especially not from this COP, just because we're in this very tricky geopolitical world currently. There was a bit of an interim COP in some way as well. We had quite a lot agreed in Dubai, which is this kind of 5-year interval from when the Paris Agreement was signed up. And the idea is we come back every 5 years as an international community to ratchet up our ambition or try and collectively be more ambitious. And that big kind of 5-year conference was in Dubai, and this one in Azerbaijan was more of an interim one where they were concentrating on aspects to do with international climate finance. That has always been this really big political hot potato where developed countries are supposed to contribute finance to developing countries to first reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases, but to also adapt to some of the kind of challenges from climate change. And there's always this big debate about how much the developed countries can afford to contribute, and the financial need from the developing countries is enormous. You have to try and connect across that impossible divide between what countries like us are prepared to contribute and then what the other countries can want.
And I know from just looking at mainstream media that there were some dramatic moments. There were some countries that kind of walked out as part of some of those negotiations. So if you're now a few days back, how well did COP perform against the expectations that you had and that you've just sort of set out?
Those sort of things do always occur. And what I would say from my experience is I don't ever quite trust diplomats to tell you exactly what's going on behind the scenes in these negotiations. I mean, there was always going to be a compromise. In fact, I'm actually surprised that we did get the good financial deal of 300 billion per year by 2035 commitment. I mean, that is a really significant chunk in this. It's quite a lot more than the developed countries had said they would contribute before. That's in a backdrop, the election in America with Donald Trump indicating he's going to completely pull out of the Paris Agreement. So the other developed countries were essentially saying that they would contribute that without America. That is significant that the whole rest of the world were prepared to do that. And of course it is really a drop in the ocean when you do get to see the impacts of climate change going on everywhere. But I think it is an indication from the 195 different countries that did go to these negotiations that, of course, we have these huge geopolitical tensions and things aren't working perfectly. But I think it's an indication that the countries do still care, that generally within their best ability, they do want to try and address the challenges of climate change. And there's huge collaboration between the different cities of the world in different countries about what they could do to try and make their towns and cities more resilient. There's also stuff going on with different activist organisations and to try and mobilise particular causes and things. So there's a whole heap of things going on, and we aren't just dependent on these inter-country negotiations, really.
Let's bring it from an international perspective down to more of a kind of UK-centric view now. And obviously, as interim chair of the Climate Change Committee, you'll be very aware that there are some very bold ambitions proposed by the UK government because they were recommended from the Climate Change Committee's 7th carbon budget that we're going to see published in February next year. I'm really keen to hear your perspective on this really ambitious target to drop emissions by 81% by 2035.
Yes, well, the Secretary of State did ask our committee for advice, and we did give him our advice at the end of October on what this level of the 2035 target should be for our country. We were very conscious. We wanted to give him the very best advice possible, so we really brought forward the analysis that we were doing anyway for the 7th carbon budget, which we will, as you said, we will publish in February, to try and give them the best advice possible. So the first thing we had to look at was what is the correct level of ambition we needed to have as a country to make a contribution to keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees that we had previously committed to. So we went back to the climate science, which is my own expertise, to try and have a look at what that's telling us. We spent a lot of time trying to have a look at where we are currently, with where things are going in this country, to try and look at the state of our economy, to try and look at where we are with sales of electric cars and things, and deployment of renewable energy. What is deliverable given our current national circumstances and policies that we have currently, to convince the government that we could deliver this very ambitious 81% reduction in a way that will ultimately be good for jobs and good for our economy. I just think, given where we are currently with the cost of living in particular, it was very important to do that work.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see such a large target and such a significant drop. From your perspective, are the enabling actions in place to facilitate that 81% reduction by 2035?
Well, I'm afraid I can't give complete details on what we're going to recommend until we publish our advice at the end of February, but what I can try and refer back to is what we did say to the government in their first week on the job. In fact, just as they won the general election last time, we also published our annual progress report to Parliament about where we are currently and what we have to do to deliver our current commitment, which is the closest one of those is the 2030 NDC target. To try and deliver to that 2030 target, we do need to see some rapid acceleration of changes. When we analysed the past government policies, we found they only had about 1/3 of the necessary policies, in fact, to deliver to that target. So we are quite pleased about that the government has done something to improve on that, particularly their real big push they've got for clean energy. That is something they've said they do. That is something they made considerable investment in. So we are quite confident that will accelerate. They also have made some investment in industry as well. So that might improve. But we have to see significant action in other areas as well, particularly get people to buy more electric cars and vans in particular. So if you're a small business and you're listening to this podcast, the chair of the CCC wants you to get out and buy an electric van. That is the best thing you could do. The other really big one that the government are agonising over, of course, is to replace our almost 27 million gas boilers with air source heating or low carbon heating of some kind. That is a big enterprise which we are really behind on. We're really behind on retrofitting and things as well. And that is the one as well which is an expensive thing to do. To install an air source heat pump, for example, is expensive. And that is the one where we do really think we have to see some really good government support. The other thing we need to celebrate, of course, is tree planting and generally to restore areas of peatland, to also really kind of support our agricultural community to change their activities in a way that they can preserve their incomes as well. So there's a whole lot of things that we will have to go on and deliver as a country if we want to get that target.
I mean, you make some really interesting points. The air source heat one, I think, is fascinating. For me, at an individual level, that's a really interesting way of people understanding the complexity of what's needed, because I've got an air source heat pump. I love it. But I did a little poll on social media before recording this episode to ask sort of people that I'm connected to whether they'd consider an air source heat pump. And just over 70% of the people that responded, and it wasn't a ginormous sample size, I'm not that popular, but about 70% said that they would, which is great. But it's also really interesting to me, the 30% that said that they wouldn't, and what those barriers to adoption are, because some of that will be very practical, technological reasons that it's not feasible. Some of that will be what they've heard. And so for me, as a kind of understanding the barriers to adoption and then really being able to help move as many of those out of the way as possible. And I think I am really interested, when I've looked back at reports that the Climate Change Committee have put to government, there's always been this sense of urgency and pace. And it sounds like actually now, from a target perspective, the government have really picked up on that and said, we have to move faster. Can you see from your role as chair of the Climate Change Committee, the kind of barriers to implementing some of that policy? And what do they look like from where you're sitting, Piers?
I think you're correct that the government, when they introduce the policies, to have to make sure they take the public with them. And I mean, perhaps I can give one key example. And government absolutely correctly doesn't want to be in the business of trying to tell people what to do, so it has to incentivize them to make the right decisions. When we installed our air source heat pump, we did get a good government grant to it of £7,500 that everyone can go and get to do the installation, and that was excellent. I think the big thing that happened to myself, and I think it's also a key recommendation of the country, is that the price of my electricity bill, the price of my gas and electricity bill combined, it probably hasn't changed too much and might have gone up a bit. So if it is going to be more expensive to do, you aren't going to get this big mass option. If you do have a look at our committee's very first recommendation to the government in that progress report, we recommended it does make the cost of electricity cheaper. We have one of the most expensive electricity prices of all EU countries, and it does in fact prevent the adoption of air source heat pumps and electric cars. But it also affects to industry. If you want to change your industry to low carbon electrification, it is a bit of a power to do it if you have to pay a lot for that electricity.
So since the new Labour government were installed earlier on this year, we've now got Mission Zero that Chris Stark, former guest on this podcast as well, is heading up. There's the National Energy System Operator, there's the Climate Change Committee. Help me understand how all of those moving parts are connected.
Yeah, okay, well, Chris in fact was my ex-chief executive on the Climate Change Committee, just in terms of the incestuousness of different people getting off to work for different organisations. We're certainly all talking to each other all the time, and we sort of try and understand what each other's up to. But it's also our job with the Climate Change Committee to be independent of government in particular. So if you just look at the job of our committee, it's to give independent advice to the government, and it's independent expert advice. So that's our job. The job of the National Energy System Operator, that is part of government now, has been brought into government, and that is the job to come up with the kind of strategic pathways for decarbonising the electricity supply to government. What we'll be doing as a Climate Change Committee is trying to look at those different kind of pathways. We'll be analysing those pathways in exactly the same independent way. We analyse everything else coming out of government. And what I would say, because does now work for this Mission Zero, which is a team of people across government and outside of government that really trying to accelerate the delivery of low-carbon electricity. I mean, that is a very challenging task that he set himself to try and deliver that. And if you have a look at some of our past advice as a committee, we almost think it's impossible to try and get that net zero, get that clean electricity supply within the next 5-year time frame, and he would have a job to do it. And what I would say, I'm quite pleased, in fact, that it's not our committee's job to do the delivery. And I think we're going to be watching what they do very carefully, and just because he used to work as my chief executive, I'm still be giving him just as hard a time. And in fact, and I don't want to be too critical of them because they're doing a good job and it is important to accelerate. But I think the sort of thing we'll be watching for as a committee is to try and make sure they do it in a way that does take the public with them. And the other thing we'll be having a look to is don't just build electricity supply for that 2030 timeline. You have to make sure it works out beyond that for 2035, 2040, 2045, 2050 timeline, where we expect increasing electricity demand. And the other thing is, of course, which we're experiencing now, we have to make sure that supply is really resilient to the threats of climate change as well. So in all my conversation with both CISO And with Ed Miliband's department, we're emphasising those things. Just don't build for that 2035 time, and really try and make sure whatever you build is resilient to the threat of climate change.
Our 2024 season of Planet Possible is supported by one of the leading engineering and design consultancies in the world, Atkins Realis. Here at Planet Possible, we bring a diverse range of voices from across the international water and environment sector to explore how to tackle some of the biggest challenges we face. And that aligns perfectly with the Atkins Realis purpose of engineering a better future for our planet and its people. We're really grateful to Atkins Realis for enabling us to bring another exciting year of Planet Possible to you. So you started to talk there about taking the public with you. I think that's really interesting. I know something that the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission talk about is about a just transition. You know, you and I have just said we both got air source heat pumps, but both of us had grants to install those air source heat pumps. And without that, well, it's a much harder job to be able to fund one, for example. So from a climate change committee perspective, where's your focus, or how are you focusing on ensuring that the rapid acceleration that we've just talked about with those targets is also one that takes the public with you and is a just and fair transition?
That's a very good point there. We spend a lot of time talking about this and a lot of time thinking about this. It's very challenging to try and make sure you do this in a way that does give opportunities for everyone. I think it is definitely possible to do it, but you have to really think about it carefully. I think the word just transition is a bit of a dangerous word in some ways. People can interpret it differently, and it does mean different things to different audiences. It could be about protecting jobs. It could be about trying to make sure the poorest in society or disabled communities are brought along with you on the kind of journey. But I just think because it's interpreted differently by different constituencies, it is a bit difficult to present it in a way to government that gets them to think about their policy design. So it's our job as a committee not to recommend particular policies. What we try and do in this having carbon budget work, we're putting a lot more consideration into these sort of aspects. We're trying to think about what sort of policy design can both deliver the necessary transition, but at the same time of doing that, do it in a way that will reduce inequalities in our society. Take the air source heat pump, for example. I mean, yeah, it was quite good I got a grant from the government to do it, and that grant came from a Conservative government, gave me that grant. Cheers for that. But perhaps I would have put an air source heat pump in without that, and perhaps that government cash that went to my back pocket, perhaps that would be more effective, trying to be used in a more targeted way to support poor communities, for example. So there are lots of different ways of doing this. So in fact, we're doing this big bit of work for the Saving Carbon budget where we're building what we call an archetype approach, where we try and have the sort of different types of houses that we've got, and we have different profiles of people and families that do live in a terrace house, a flat, a semi-detached, or what sort of property they have got, and try and look at what sort of policies do work for those families and what is the best way to target government finances in particular, and what amount of investment can come from the people themselves and what amount can come from businesses to be able to deliver the necessary change. So there ought to be good ways to design your policy where you can affect the necessary change and you can hopefully reduce the cost of people's electricity bills at the same time, and you can also give them the kind of security they need. And what I would like to see government do a lot more of, in fact, is to begin to devolve a lot of this authority and the capacity of the delivery to local authorities, and for communities to come with ideas for their communities and things. I think this idea of co-design could be done much better than it has been done, where individual communities do probably understand what is the very best thing that works for their own communities. So I think there are some exciting things that we could possibly do to try and decarbonise, but to also do things like reduce fuel poverty and things at the same time. I like to see the government and local governments working together in a far more connected way than they have been to try to deliver some of these changes in a way that works. And I think if you look at the whole residential building sector in particular, there are some good examples, and we have some great examples within our own communities as well, where things have really changed. But if you look across the country, there are different governments have tried to introduce different things that haven't really worked, and the government just have to keep on trying, experiment with what works, and to try and get on to really deliver some urgent changes in a way that works for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting when you think about how your climate brief overlaps with the challenges we've got around housing growth, for example. And I know often on Planet Possible, we talk to people from a water perspective, and, there's so many opportunities when you build new housing to do it really well and to think about a lower water footprint and a lower carbon footprint. And side note, drives me mad when I see new housing developments with acres of roofs with not a solar panel inside. I just think, what on earth? However, we know that the bulk of the housing stock in the UK is not new. So there's a lot to do with retro.
It's terrible, Niki. People are still building brand new properties with gas boilers in them that will have to be retrofitted in kind of 5 years' time for air source heat pumps, and that makes everything more expensive and it's so unnecessary.
Yeah, I agree entirely. No, that's my little soapbox. I'm totally with you on that one. But I think, the bulk of the housing stock is not brand new, actually. And so the other challenge, I think, is about how do we ensure that homes are well insulated? Because from my perspective, the single most consequential thing we've done with this house is not the solar panels and the air source heat pump and the MVHR, it's really well insulated, and that's made a huge difference to our bills. So I guess it's making sure that, at individual level, all of those opportunities are there, regardless of whether you're in a new home or you're in a late 1800s terrace, that you can still do the best you possibly can. I've got one final question for you, if this is okay, and I ask all my guests this. So I'm going to pass you the Planet Possible magic wand. Give it a wave. You can make anything in this space possible. What would you want?
Well, as I'm on the climate change committee, I'm going to talk about that, just because I just got back from the COP negotiations where we've been supporting other countries to try and set up committee like our one. And what our committee does, it was set up by the Climate Change Act in 2008, and it had always been supportive but constant challenge to government to deliver ambitious climate action, partly because we have an official job as the government nagger, that's our job. You haven't done enough, do more here. But the thing is, the government have to pay attention to what we're talking about, and the government perhaps don't really enjoy doing that all the time, but it has really delivered in this country. That we have a track record of decarbonising our economy successfully across successive governments, whether they were coalition government, whether they're Labour government or Conservative. And what I got from the COP when I was there, that is the envy of other countries around the world, in fact. COP, we talk about the countries that either just has set up committee like our committee or were beginning to do it, countries like kind of Brazil, Colombia, Estonia, Ukraine, China. They're all thinking they have to have something like our expert committee advising their governments to really try and keep the government honest, and not only one government, successive government, and not over kind of 5-year terms, over 10, 20, 30-year terms to really deliver the change. So if I could have one thing from your Planet Possible, what I would say, to have a really cool committee like the Climate Change Committee in every country's constitution to really deliver this long-term change.
It's a really positive note to end it on, really, Piers, as well. Thank you. It's wonderful to hear that something that we're doing in the UK is being done so well. Brazil, if you're listening for COP30, I think that's the next one, isn't it? Maybe they will embed exactly that in time for then. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, well, that's what we had. So we had a conversation with the kind of Brazilians and a conversation with Chinese to really try and do just that.
Amazing. Well, let's watch this space. Piers, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
It's been excellent to talk to you too.
Okay, Rosa, so what are your initial reflections on the interview with Piers?
First of all, it's a delight to hear Piers talk about his take on things. He's a fascinating individual in high demand. So to be able to listen to him talk about everything from UK leadership through to how that actually plays out in those COP negotiations and the reality of some of the tensions and the behaviours and things and how that's portrayed in the media. I found it all very reassuring, actually. Piers' explanations of how the CCC relate to the NISO that's been set up and Chris Stark's Mission Zero, the role of the CCC in supporting the government achieve its ambitions. That was really helpful.
I thought he made it sound really straightforward, and it's probably the first time that I have ever felt like a COP didn't seem that complicated, so there's a real skill in that. Piers and I talked about enabling actions to drive these ambitious policy changes, this 81% reduction by 2035. Is that where the role of climate commissions like the one that you lead comes in?
Yeah, I think so. So the Leeds Climate Commission was in fact the first climate commission that was formed, and it was back in 2016, 2017, where my predecessor, Professor Andy Gouldson, came up with the idea. He's a professor in environment and climate governance. He worked with Leeds University, Leeds City Council and partners around the city to create the Climate Commission in response to the Paris Agreement and the need to create a space where you can bring together actors from all different sectors to be able to play their part. Because of the pace at which we're going to have to deliver change, we can't wait for the trickle-down effect of policy. We need to go much further and faster, and everybody has more power and influence and ability to change things than maybe they first realise when they look at this and see the discussions on that international stage. We work with the politicians, we build networks, and we tackle issues, but in a very constructive way, in a way that means that the people that we're working with, hopefully their confidence is built, their connections are stronger, so therefore then they can take better action and help us respond to the climate emergency and nature emergencies effectively.
You must therefore be thinking about barriers to policy adoption if you're convening some of those stakeholders. None of this transition that we're moving through is straightforward. So from a regional perspective, what are some of those big barriers to policy adoption and how are you tackling them?
There are a few. For me, one of them is funding. And the reason I say funding, policy should be separate to funding, but I think the reality that we know that the funding challenge is massive kind of weakens the confidence to change the policy. It kind of raises as a sort of unspoken, well, what's the point kind of question that I think can create a bit of either lethargy or just means it drops down the priority list sometimes, to realise those changes and certainly to be able to then deliver them. It's a very stark reality. My challenge back to that is there's a lot of money, actually. There's a lot of money at play. The government is spending a lot of money. Businesses spend a lot of money. Organisations spend a lot of money. They do it through their procurement, through their supply chains. As consumers, we spend. So actually, there's quite a lot of money. It's about what we're choosing to spend it on and the expectations that are in place and what the case for investment is. So, for example, my understanding is that at the moment, there's significant skewing towards cars on roads in terms of transport investment. But actually, if we were to look at the wider picture of public health co-benefits, of active travel, provision in our transport system and reflected those fully within the cost-benefit ratios, that would steer decisions away from investing in more lanes on highways, motorways, and bring it more into cities and places where people live, and those day-to-day benefits will be realised. And actually, that will make a really big difference. It makes a huge difference in terms of our carbon emissions and the ability for people to make good decisions. We need to be able to make good decisions easier fundamentally, and at all levels. So we need to make good decisions easier for policymakers. That means looking at the investment cycles and the framing and what goes into those investment decisions, what's being weighed up. It means on a day-to-day basis for individuals, choices need to be made very clear and direct, and they need to be made simple for people, easy to access and affordable. So funding is a big barrier around many different aspects of policy implementation.
It's interesting, we spoke to Sophie Howe when she was the Future Generations Commissioner for the Welsh Government. It was really interesting hearing about the Future Generations legislation, which is not in law in England, but it is in Wales, and about the impact that that's had on some of their big decisions. So she gave an example of choosing not to invest in a new section of motorway and actually reinvesting that cash into active travel, supporting all of the things that you've just talked about, because when you think about future generations and the impact, then it enables you to make slightly different decisions. Seeing that in practice, actually, if you can create the framework to make decisions in a slightly more holistic way, often the right decisions for climate are likely to come out, really. Okay, Rosa, so Piers talked about enabling more kind of place-based leadership, making decisions in the places that are affected by those decisions. And I know that the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission has been supported from its outset by the Yorkshire Leaders Board, so all of the leaders of those combined authorities and the mayors. There's obviously an appetite from regional government and mayoral authorities to work together. What does that mean in practice, do you think? What change can be affected at regional level, and what are some of the tensions that you're dealing with?
There's a lot that can be done at regional level. And I think one of our challenges is to make sure that we're doing everything that we can within the existing policy framework and with the funding that we've got at the moment. We do know that there is a massive discrepancy between what we think is needed. So in our Carbon Story publication that we released in the summer, we are clear that we need about £7.3 billion per annum for the next 15 years to reach our target of net zero by 2038. On the flip side, by 2050, because of the long-term health benefits of that change and that transition, it's more than cost beneficial. And by 2040, it's cost beneficial in terms of just energy savings, in terms of household bills. And therefore, the idea is that that funding would then be recycled around the economy. That's what we know we need within the region. To put that sum in context, the current spend from government towards net zero targets is 7.3 billion for the country over the next 5 years. So we need that sum per annum for the next 15 years for our region. That really shows, for me, the scale of investment that's needed. So collaboration in that context is absolutely essential. One, we've got to keep making the case, and unifying our voices to make that case is really powerful. And we see that at COP, when Piers talking about the geopolitical context on a global scale and the power of all the other countries in the world doubling down on their commitments and saying they're going to keep going when the United States is in a quite different and challenging place, I think is really important. It's really motivating, and it's fundamental to success. So the same thing applies within the UK, and it applies within the region and between local authorities and between town and parish councils and community groups. Everybody needs to be able to see that there are only a few people who are going to be bold enough to really lead it on their own. And ultimately, they're only going to be so successful if they do it on their own. But if people can come together and work together on common aims and ambitions, it's only going to be helpful. There are some very practical realities. The practical realities of catchment management and land management mean we need to work across political boundaries. That, for me, is where the power of collaboration comes in. In terms of some of the tensions, it's just really, at the moment, genuinely, so there is money, but levering it, being able to change its sort of direction and pivot it into these places is really hard. And that requires some upfront investment and resources. It requires risk taking. And the reality is, in our public sector organisations, that is extremely hard. And as Piers was highlighting, those decisions need to be made easier. It takes many hands to do that, and many minds.
Time flies. So final question for you. I am going to pass you the Planet Possible magic wand. Give it a wave and tell me what you want to make possible in this space.
So I'm slightly influenced by Piers's magic wand, which I thought was fantastic in terms of global outreach and the fact that he was able to back it up with, and yes, I'm talking to China and Brazil about exactly that. Amazing, Piers, go you. It's just brilliant. So it'd be something similar, actually. I talked about Climate Commission network across the UK and that there are more than 25. I would really like to see that model rolled out consistently across the UK. I think they have just such a fundamental role to play to support all the actors, like we've explored in our conversation, to do more, to do what they can, to build their confidence, to create the new skills, the new technologies that are needed, to maintain the uniqueness of place that we've got across the UK. There's so much diversity, and we can really harness that and make that a strength. Let's celebrate the climate commissions that we've got, increase them, fund them properly, and enable them to help us work to all 4 pillars of climate action, not just net zero, but thinking about nature recovery, adaptation and resilience, and doing that in a way that is fair and just.
I completely agree with you. And I think if we want system scale change, which is what we're talking about for climate, but what we often talk about on this pod for management of water, for example, then you do need a vehicle, don't you, to be able to enable all of those people to come together. And often place is the thing that everyone can orientate around. So yeah, totally agree. Right, as ever, time has flown by. We are here at the end of another episode of Planet Possible. So thank you everybody for joining us. I hope you found the conversation insightful. I really hope it's given you something to think about in your world. You can subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode, and we love to hear your ratings and reviews too. And we've got more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year, including one on the floods in Valencia in our next month's episode. So all that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to my superb guests. So that's Professor Piers Forster and my wonderful co-host Rosa Foster. Thank you, Rosa.
Thank you, Niki.
That's it, everyone. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.